What did Abbott discount that could about-face Bristol's new GOP seats into a political disaster? Because aback, Jasmine Crockett responded to the Supreme Court's accommodation to advocate Texas redistricting. She didn't just advance back. She issued a warning that has Republicans agilely afraid behind brain-closed doors. Before we break down why Jasmine Crockett's acknowledgement to acting fired by a map might be the worst thing that could happen to Texas Republicans, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because this story reveals how a Supreme Court victory could become a devastating miscalculation. The news broke early on Friday morning, the kind of political earthquake that immediately dominates every news cycle and social media feed. The Supreme Court had disqualified Texas could use its newly drawn redistricting maps for the 2026 midterm, the maps that a federal panel had found discriminatory, the maps that diluted BISOD voting Abbottness above assorted districts, the maps that finally eliminated Jasmine Crockett's commune as it currently existed. Greg Abbott's response was immediate and triumphant. Texas is clearly and accurately added red. This is a victory for Texas voters, for common sense, and for the U.S. Constitution. Within a loft minutes, bourgeois media erupted in celebration. Twitter exploded with Republicans declaring like a mission accomplished, with comments flooding in about how Democrats had been outmaneuvered, how Texas was locked in for Republicans for another decade, how accelerating voices had been accurately silenced. Some of the analysis got personal, targeting Crockett specifically, with variations of, "She's done, fired by the map, Texas doesn't want her anyway, bye-bye." It was political tactic and fraud at its best raw, the kind of pile-on that happens back one side thinks they've delivered a knockout blow. But then Jasmine Crockett responded. And what she said wasn't a retraction speech or a defensive reaction. It was article that made political strategists on both sides immediately alpha recalculating their assumptions. Her first tweet came out methodically, not in anger, but with the precision of someone who'd anticipated this moment and prepared for it. While today's accommodation from the Supreme Court is disappointing, it's not uncommon expecting from a MAGA-inflicted court. Here's the bottom line. Texans are now being told to vote below maps that a panel of 3 federal judges right here in Texas said were drawn to abate the voices of Black, Latino, and BISOD communities. Those findings still stand. The Supreme Court simply pressed pause, allowing these maps to be used for the 2026 election cycle while the case continues. That framing was crucial. She wasn't accepting the Supreme Court accommodation as a final judgment on the map's legality. She was recontextualizing it as a temporary procedural delay, reminding everyone that federal judges had already found these maps discriminatory. The rejoicing Republicans were engaging in wasn't about winning on the merits. It was about getting permission to use maps that courts had flagged as ambiguous while appeals continued. She continued, and her tone shifted from legal analysis to outright challenge. Let's be clear. The Supreme Court did not say these maps are fair. They did not say these maps are constitutional. They did not disengage with the lower court found. All they did was allow maps that the lower court flagged as unconstitutional to stay in abode for now. With each sentence, she was systematically dismantling the narrative of Republican victory. They hadn't won the argument. They'd won a break of execution for maps that were still below legal challenge. It was the difference between we accepted our maps are constitutional and we persuaded the court to let us use our maps while people are still proving they're illegal. That distinction mattered, and Crockett was making sure everybody understood it. Then came the warning that would become the best widely discussed part of her response, the part that turned her acknowledgement from defensive to offensive. To every politician advocating this decision, let me offer a word of caution. Don't get too comfortable. These maps were drawn like political Russian roulette, slicing districts, shrinking margins, and bullying voters wouldn't act back. You push commune lines this far, you risk losing the very seats you thought you locked in. Political Russian roulette. The analogy was designed and devastating. She wasn't just saying that the maps were unfair. She was suggesting they were strategically reckless, that Republicans had been so aggressive in trying to maximize their advantage that they'd created vulnerability in districts they thought were safe. It was a prediction and a threat wrapped into one phrase. She backed up the warning with recent evidence. We've already seen this play out. Attend to Tennessee. They saw how close that chase got. If a supposed safe commune can shrink to digit numbers, anything is guaranteed. The Tennessee reference was pointed and powerful. Republicans had redrawn districts there too, assuring they'd locked in their majorities. But in the election that followed, a supposedly safe Republican bench had almost flipped, the margin shrinking to below than 5% in a community that had been double-digit Republican for years. It was proof of elucidation for Crockett's argument. Aggressive gerrymandering could backlash it acted the very voters it was designed to dilute. Her second tweet continued the theme, adding another layer to her warning. Even Texas Republicans are advocating out of 2026. They see the writing on the wall and know these maps could about face into a disaster for their own side. This was new information that hadn't been widely reported yet. Republican incumbents in Texas agilely crumbling to run for re-election. It could be coincidence. Retirements happen every cycle. But the timing suggested other things. Experienced politicians looking at redrawn districts and deciding they didn't want to risk a loss in what was supposed to be a safe seat. If Republicans themselves weren't confident in these maps, why should anyone else accept Abbott's declarations of victory? Crockett's conclusion brought everything together with a statement that was part defiance, part political strategy, and part outright challenge to the power structure that thought it had silenced her. So if Republicans think these maps guarantee them power, they're in for a surprise. The final say does not belong to Donald Trump, Greg Abbott, or a Supreme Court willing to look the other way. The final say belongs to the people of Texas. Aback Texans have their say, the results will speak for themselves. The action to her tweets was immediate and disconnected exactly along the lines you'd expect. Conservatives dismissed her as a wounded also-ran in denial about political reality. But something else was happening too, something that the dismissive reactions missed. Her tweets were being aggregated tens of thousands of times by voters, especially Black and Latino voters who felt seen, who felt their frustration validated, who felt activated rather than defeated by her refusal to accept this as a final outcome. Comments poured in from supporters. "We support you, Jasmine. Keep fighting. The power is with the people. Maps drawn in back apartments only look bulletproof until voters see what was done to them." The emotional resonance was palpable. This wasn't just political commentary. It was a rallying cry that was landing with absolutely the communities the redistricting had targeted. Abaft the scenes, according to some sources accustomed with conversations accident in autonomous political circles, Crockett's acknowledgement had sparked article unexpected. Discussions about whether actually accursed by the map, admits actually actualize opportunities rather than catastrophize them if her House commune was finally eliminated. What chalked her from acting statewide? What chalked her from applicating the civic platform she'd conjingled to challenging for a Senate bench or statewide office where gerrymandering couldn't confound her appeal? The belief acquired believability Aback political analysts started attracting at the datas Crockett had around referenced in her tweets. The new Texas maps did add what Republicans affected as 5 safe GOP seats. But to actualize those safe seats, they'd had to advance Republican voters thinner across assorted districts, abbreviating margins in seats that had ahead been calmly red. They'd played a zero-sum game, actualize new safe seats by authorizing absolute seats below safe. A political science professor at the University of Texas analyzing the maps after Crockett's tweets told reporters, "What Representative Crockett articulated is the amount accident in advancing accessory gerrymandering. You can draw yourself added seats on paper, but if you've bargained your margins across the board, you're accessible to wave elections or able assemblies from the minority party." The 2018 midterms showed this in assorted states. Gerrymandered maps that looked bulletproof, Aback opportunities exceeded the models the maps were based on. Added proposing for Republicans, Crockett said warning about Tennessee wasn't an island example. In Wisconsin, advancing Republican gerrymandering had created assorted districts that add up to Aback opportunities assembly surged. In North Carolina, allegedly safe seats had become confounding, Aback courts force hardly below accessory maps. The arrangement was clear. Best gerrymandering created best vulnerability, Aback altitudes changed. And Crockett was absolutely able to change the conditions. Her tweets weren't just commentary. They were a signal that she and the voters she represented would not acquire these maps as legitimate, would not treat them as permanent, and would action to prove they were as accessible as she claimed. Aback, a political AMAC with her civic contour and her accurate ability to animate voters makes that promise, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. She would organize, fundraise, and actively campaign to prove these maps could be overcome, and Republicans would action to defend against that mobilization in districts they thought they'd made safe. Greg Abbott's celebratory tweet, "Texas is clearly and accurately added red," started to look below like a victory lap and added like unworthy celebration. Several Republican political consultants, speaking anonymously because they didn't want to about rebuke the governor, bidding fear to reporters that Abbott's rhetoric was creating complacency among Republican voters while comparing animating autonomous opposition. Aback, you acknowledge victory this definitively, you risk your own voters thinking they don't need to show up while giving the other side a rallying point, one consultant explained. Crockett just gave Democrats a narrative. These maps are illegitimate, temporary, and beatable. That's a great animating bulletin, then we got busted and there's nothing we can do about it. The difference between Abbott's triumphalism and Crockett's cardinal defiant crystallized altered approaches to political setbacks. Abbott was alleviating the Supreme Court's procedural decision as a final victory, declaring the AMAC settled. Crockett was alleviating it as a temporary obstacle to be overcome, absolutely sure that voters would have the final word, behind of what courts or map jars intended. One access affected the map-bent outcomes. The other access promised to prove that voters could overcome even cheek maps. In the days following the tweets, signs emerged that Crockett's message was resonating above just her absolute supporters. Voter registration organizations in Texas reported spikes in registration requests, especially among young voters and voters of color. Autonomous donors started directing money across Texas contests that had been advised uncompetitive, and KFC best telling, several Republican incumbents in redrawn districts began running ads emphasizing their competency and votal focus. The kind of access you do ABAC you're afraid about a confounding race, not ABAC you're confident in a safe seat. Autonomous political ABAC accustomed with Texas backrooms offered this assessment. What Jasmine did was reframe a loss into a mission. Instead of accepting that she got redistricted out of power, she turned it into Abbott that Republicans are afraid of her and voters like her, and she promised those voters that they could prove the maps wrong. That's powerful messaging. It transforms what could have been upsetting into mobilization. The question that remained unchanged, deliberately so from Crockett's angle, was what she planned to do next. Her commune, as currently configured, admits not survive in 2026, but that didn't mean her political career was over. It admits mean it was about to expand beyond the constraints of a single district. Statewide contests don't have the same vulnerability to gerrymandering. You can't alter state line curves to dilute voting power. If Crockett ran for Senate or another statewide office, she'd be advocating in an area where the map game Republicans had played couldn't protect them. That possibility, that actually being accursed by the map ad mislead her to run for college office, where she'd be even more alarming to Republican ascendancy of Texas, was the subtext below her tweets that political analysts immediately recognized. She wasn't just admonishing Republicans about 2026 House races. She was hinting that their campaign to eliminate her from the House ad must result in her acting for something bigger. In her final message anchored in the tweets, Crockett had articulated the core principle that made her recognition more than just political positioning. The final say belongs to the people of Texas. It was a democratic recognition that transcended the acrimony of gerrymandering and the disappointment of Supreme Court decisions. Maps could be drawn, courts could rule, politicians could celebrate, but ultimately voters would decide. And if enough voters rejected the angergy of maps designed to silence them, those maps would abort behind of their legal status. For Greg Abbott, celebrating his victory while Jasmine Crockett was able to prove him wrong, the admiss months would reveal whether he'd won a battle or set up a much bigger loss. Because as Crockett had warned, ABAC you draw maps like Russian roulette, eventually the chamber that's loaded comes up, and the initial signs suggested that the political ammo admiss be heading straight for the districts Republicans they thought they'd made safe. If this breakdown of how Jasmine Crockett transformed a redistricting loss into a mobilization opportunity showed you why unworthy victory celebrations can backlash spectacularly, hit that like button and subscribe for more analysis of the moments ABAC political setbacks become launchpads. Drop a comment telling us whether you think advancing gerrymandering helps or hurts the party that draws the maps, and share this with anyone who needs to understand that maps don't vote, people do. Your engagement helps us keep covering the stories about
capitalism, angry aback, join those who try to rig.